Have you ever noticed that when you paint something right in the center of your paper or canvas, it might look a little bit boring, just sort of floating up in the air surrounded by white space? But if I add some thoughtful background elements, all of a sudden the whole composition comes alive. We'll come back to this later and I will show you the exact trick I use whenever I'm stuck with my watercolor backgrounds. But first, let's go all the way back to the start and talk about the main watercolor mistakes that every beginner makes at some point and what you can do to fix them. I will show you the full process of how I painted these dusty roses, and you can find the full list of materials in the video description below. You can also download my reference photos and practice at your own pace. I'm going to start by painting a very thin, very watery layer of pink all over the flowers using quinacridone red and quinacridone violet. As I'm putting down my colors, I will share what I think is watercolor mistake number 1, not because it's the worst necessarily, but because it's the one that practically everyone makes in the beginning, no matter if you're a self-taught artist or taking classes. And I'm talking about painting the details before painting the background layers of color. Specifically, painting the darker, smaller elements like tiny lines and shadows before creating the overall tone, or what I like to call a map of color. A much more eloquent and witty art YouTuber named Proco calls this icing before the cake, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We want to focus on fancy details and all the fun parts before taking care of the foundation. I'm very guilty of this myself. It's very natural, and the best way to avoid it is to remind yourself that this way of painting will inevitably lead us to a whole bunch of issues later on in the process. So when you start working on these intricate lines and shadows in one area, forgetting to set the tone everywhere else, you're running a risk of overworking one area, introducing unnecessary pigments and details that are too dark that you can't erase. And this is the worst part, you're bound to create a very disjointed set of shapes that look completely separate from one another. So to make it very practical, notice that I have been covering the 3 main flowers and even the 4th background flower all at once with a combination of my light pink colors. I'm not focusing on one petal at a time, but rather on creating the overall tone. This is what will hold the entire painting together, so to speak. Everything I paint going forward is on top of this large layer of color, and each layer of shadow will build upon the rest. With watercolors, it's not just important, it is essential, because remember, we don't have the luxury of painting with lighter colors on top of dark like we do with acrylics or gouache, and with some very rare exceptions, we can't erase anything. So laying down the foundation using the lightest value, in other words, the lightest color, is absolutely key. Watercolor mistake number 2 is prioritizing your colors over your values, meaning over your lights and shadows. This one will probably surprise many of you, especially if you ever spend time looking for that perfect shade of pink for your roses, but I can tell you with confidence that although matching colors to the reference is great fun, it is not essential. What is important is matching your values, meaning your lights and darks, because the contrast in values, the smooth and most importantly the logical transition between lights and shadows, is what creates a sense of realistic 3-dimensional shape on paper. Which colors you end up using ultimately won't matter as much, and I will show you a very neat trick towards the end to illustrate this point. But as long as your shadows are placed correctly and your ratio of paint to water, which is for the most part what determines how light or how dark something appears, as long as it's applied correctly, you're on the right track. Notice that I used 3 different shades of blue on the first layer on the bird, and now I'm painting a thick layer of shadows on the roses using 3 different shades of pink. I'm using this kind of variety simply for fun. It's a stylistic choice. I don't care very much where those different hues of pink and blue end up as they spread on paper. What I am paying very close attention to is the relative value, meaning how dark these colors are. The shadows I'm painting on the roses are roughly in the middle of the value scale. You can see the scale on the top right of my screen. It's basically a scale of how saturated you can go from 0 to 10. For this layer, I'm aiming to just have a step or two darker than my first layer, but not fully saturated yet, because I know I need some room for painting even smaller shadows within those larger shapes later on. This will be my third and fourth layer of color. And you may be wondering how many layers of color I apply to a typical painting. I get this question a lot, and the answer is 3 to 4. Sometimes I go crazy and I get all the way up to 7 if my paper is thick enough, which is a nice segue to my discussion on watercolor mistake number 3. Using the wrong paper. What many beginners don't realize is that mixed media or student grade watercolor paper is a completely different product from what is typically known as professional watercolor paper. We're basically comparing wood pulp to cotton. These are two different materials and they produce two very different results. Watercolor is meant to be used only on cotton by design, and when you apply your paint, no matter how expensive and how pigmented it is, to a non-cotton surface, it behaves very differently. It's ironic because as a beginner, you may attribute a lack of progress to your lack of skills, but it's not necessarily the case. And what I actually see in the work of my students is more often than not, just a lack of natural blending that comes as a result of not using the right paper, not using cotton. So none of this layering that you see on screen, even the most basic wet on wet washes, would work on a student grade paper that's not cotton, because by now the surface would have been warped and buckled under the pressure of having all these watery layers. And even if you're layering your colors skillfully and carefully, the pigments just won't blend together smoothly because they can't, and the effect would be very patchy and unfortunately very dull. Now, I recognize that 100% cotton paper is not cheap, and there are a few things you can do to save the money. In general, 50% cotton paper is good enough compromise for practice and learning. I would still invest in a few sheets of 100% cotton just to see for yourself what you're actually capable of when you're painting on the right surface. And you can buy these large sheets of, for example, arches or arch paper like the one I'm working on, and cut them up in smaller sheets. This way it's a lot cheaper. And finally, don't worry about those super thick 300-pound cotton sheets. Those are way too expensive and unnecessary. Really a splurge if you ask me. 140 pounds is more than enough, and that's all I work on. You see how much I layer, and I promise you, if you've never painted on pure cotton, you will be shocked at how much your work will improve. It's well worth it before investing in fancy paints or brushes. Now, to illustrate all these points I've made about light and shadow and how relatively unimportant your choice of color is, I'm going to do two kind of drastic things because I really want you to embrace these insights. First, I'm going to apply a bunch of unrelated pigments to this branch, just pretty much anything I have within my reach. The only thing I care about is how light the colors are as they dance and intermingle on the page. As long as the value is somewhere around 5 or 6, it doesn't actually matter to me what colors I'm using. Now, you may think, okay, the branch is kind of unimportant and low risk area to experiment with, which is true, but I will show you something else. Let me completely remove all colors from the screen using my editor, and I think it might be eye-opening. I think you can see that the shapes of the flowers still appear somewhat realistic. You can still read them, so to speak, without all the color variation. And I can bring back the saturation and adjust the color palette temporarily. Still, the petal shapes are recognizable. This is a function of having placed the lights and darks in the right places. It's not that the colors are not important, they are, but they're secondary, something that you can simplify and worry much less about, especially if you're still learning the watercolor medium. Once the shadows are ready, you can always glaze additional pigments on top of the completed painting. Like in this case, I decided to add a few yellow glazes on the bird and on the flowers where I felt it was appropriate. And I can do this without much worry because the main shapes are already painted and look quite three-dimensional. Let me know in comments below if you found these tips helpful or if you think I have completely missed the mark with the list. There may be other mistakes or issues that you think are much more important for learning watercolor medium, and I'm happy to cover them in detail in future videos. But now, as I promised in the beginning, I wanted to demonstrate how I added the background elements towards the end and explain the trick that I use when I'm not sure how to treat the background. I actually ran a poll on my Instagram and asked my followers what they thought would be the best approach. The majority thought that just adding some greenery around the bird and the roses would be the best solution. By the way, I have like the best group and I can always ask you guys for feedback, and you always give me the best advice on how to proceed when I'm stuck. So I went with this approach, maybe a bit further because I added some smaller flowers in addition to the leaves. But the trick is I always arrange my supporting background elements on a diagonal, in this case from bottom left to top right. It's one of the most important fundamentals of good composition because diagonal lines create a strong sense of movement and a lot of visual interest. If you want to see a full guide on how I build my watercolor compositions, including my image sources, my inspiration formula that I borrow from Chinese art, and some other useful tricks, you can watch my recent guide here on YouTube, and I will link it up on the screen and also in the video description below.